So could a simple picture like this one save a life? It's a brain scan that some argue shows brain damage. There is a battle brewing in Tampa courtrooms between the doctors and the lawyers over the controversial brain test that created the images. Attorneys defending some of the Bay Area's most notorious accused murderers want to use the test to save their clients from a death sentence. Umberto Delgado, charged with the shooting death of Tampa Police Corporal Mike Roberts. Kenneth Jackson, accused of kidnapping, raping, and stabbing a neighbor to death, her body discovered inside a stolen, burned-out minivan. Richard McTeer, prosecutors say he tossed his girlfriend's baby out of a car and onto I-275. And now, for the first time, at the same time, Hillsborough County criminal court judges are being asked to look at scans of their brains.
The defense would call Dr. Robert Thatcher.
On Friday, Delgado's attorney called Dr. Robert Thatcher, a man some say is a pioneer in quantitative electroencephalogram, or QEEG technology.
It's just the quantification using a computer of the electrical energies.
Is it possible that accused killers have brain defects so severe it can be exposed in picture form, undeniable images, the kind a judge or a jury could look at and decide if someone should live or die?
It's like a electron microscope to go in more deeply, or like the Hubble telescope to look at things that you can't see just by eye.
But the assistant state attorney says Florida does not recognize QEEG as real forensic science, and also criticizes the doctor's motives.
The more NeuroGuide software that's sold puts more money in your pocket.
Well, yes, it's a business.
Tampa neuropsychologist William Lambos used Thatcher's program and his techniques to perform a QEEG on Delgado at the jail months ago. Prosecutors think his diagnosis is a stretch.
I believed it likely that he met the legal definition of insanity.
News Channel 8's search of court records shows the public defender also hired Lambos to examine Richard McTeer, Kenneth Jackson, and several others.
And the sensors are spaced in a way.
It looks like something out of this world. Science fiction.
This is more or less what it looks like when it's on.
In his office, Dr. Lambos put the sensor cap on his own head to show us how, in about 10 minutes, he can record all the brainwave activity needed to diagnose a problem. What you're about to hear sounds complicated. Dr. Lambos makes a brain map by translating EEG wave readings into numbers and images, then compares it to Thatcher's database of, quote, normal brain maps. A report and expert testimony on a single case like this can cost the public defender's office and you, the taxpayer, more than $10,000. Lambos feels it's money well spent.
If I can add information that's valuable and helps a jury make a rational decision about whether somebody should be given one sentence versus another, I feel that I'm doing something valuable.
He hopes QEEG leads to big changes in the courts.
A phrase that I've heard before is that this might be considered, on the forensic side, the equivalent of the 21st century equivalent to DNA.
USF neuropsychiatrist Dr. Gabriel Dayarouskin says it's helpful in the Alzheimer's research he oversees at the Roskamp Institute, but he does not feel QEEG is ready for the courtroom.
I think it's a mistake.
Dr. Dayarouskin believes the 50 or so comparative databases that exist to date are not comprehensive enough.
So, you have to have a lot of clinical information beforehand if you are going to make a case that quantitative EEG can make a definitive diagnosis of anything. Once we do that, we can have sufficient information to move on the case. Before that, we can't, and that information is simply not there.
With the exception of one criminal case in Miami, Stetson Law professor Robert Beatty agrees and knows visuals can be powerful and persuasive to a jury.
You want to hear evidence, but you also want to see it. And the more inputs you can give a juror, the more likely you are to get your message across to that juror.
But QEEGs will only make a difference in cases like these when judges allow them as evidence.
It's the defense attorney's obligation to investigate the use of this. It's probably ultimately going to be the state's obligation to pay for it.
And Beatty says that could take years. The public defender does not discuss ongoing cases. Humberto Delgado's murder trial is set to begin next Monday, and we will keep you updated on what the judge decides about admitting that QEEG test evidence. And now at 8 on your side, follow up with life and death ramifications. It's about using science in the courtroom. It's really nothing new. Fingerprint identification dates back to the 1800s. DNA analysis began in 1986. But now the Hillsborough County public defender wants the court to admit brain science as evidence in death penalty cases. Maybe it could explain a killer's mental state. Maybe it could prevent an unnecessary death. Or maybe, as critics argue, it's just taxpayer-funded junk science, better left to the world of science fiction. Science fiction films require a willing suspension of disbelief.
By experimental science, by a man whose abnormal passions inspired him to try the impossible.
If the science is too unbelievable, it can be a turnoff. That's true in the movies and in the courts.
The defense would call Dr. Robert Thatcher.
Dr. Robert Thatcher is a pioneer in something called quantitative EEG brain mapping technology.
The science is solid.
It's been around for decades and is respected for its ability to provide information on brain injury and impairment.
The brain is what the brain is. And then I just simply present that.
But when Dr. Thatcher and others like Tampa neuropsychologist Dr. William Lambos try to explain how all of this works in court,
The sensors are spaced in a way.
they open themselves up to scrutiny.
This is more or less what it looks like when it's on.
It can be a lot for jurors to wrap their heads around, comparing a database of normal brain activity to what a neuroscientist describes as dysregulation.
No normal mind can imagine.
Prosecutors are often the most vocal critics.
That's science fiction. That's hocus pocus trickery, junk science.
Yeah, well, it's just simply false.
According to Dr. Thatcher, 100,000 peer-reviewed journal articles back up his claim that QEEG is an established science. He believes it meets what the legal system calls the Fry standard, which is simply the general acceptance test for introducing scientific evidence into a trial.
And what about judges who are sitting and deciding whether they should allow QEEG?
They, in my opinion, should follow the law. There's the Fry standards. If the test is reliable, it's not junk science, it's not novel science, it's accepted science. People are using it all the time.
QEEG may be the only thing left that can save Kenneth Ray Jackson. A Tampa jury recommended the death penalty after finding Jackson guilty of raping and murdering a Seffner mother of 3.
I look at this QEEG as something that, if I were not doing it, I perhaps am not being an effective lawyer.
Julianne Holt is the Hillsborough County public defender who represents Jackson.
Databases are also used with DNA studies.
She compares the skepticism over using QEEG results in court to the early years of DNA forensics. You don't see many questioning that science anymore.
The reality of it is it does assist, I think, a jury in making a better decision in their mind.
But it doesn't come cheap. A brain map and expert testimony can cost taxpayers more than $10,000 a case. Florida Supreme Court justices suggest that's money well spent.
At times, there are cutting-edge scientific developments that have to be tested through a court system.
We don't want our citizens thinking, well, they're getting justice on the cheap, and especially when the death penalty is involved.
Kenneth Jackson's brain has already been mapped. He's now waiting for Judge William Fuente to hold a Spencer hearing, which is where a judge makes the ultimate decision about how to sentence someone.
You know, Judge, someone has to go out on the limb and say, this is the new wave, this is the new technology, and you have to open that door.
Holt believes this argument will eventually make its way to a higher court.
This is one of those decisions that you really do think should get to the Florida Supreme Court and to the United States Supreme Court sooner rather than later. There is no doubt about it.
All this may be racing to a destiny that defies belief. Science, not fiction, with life-saving potential. Now, the state attorney's office has been critical of this in the past, reminding us that Florida does not recognize QEEG as real forensic science. And they even questioned Dr. Thatcher's motive, suggesting that he stands to make a lot of money off of this by selling his software. But of course, Dr. Thatcher disputes that.
Well, has this kind of science ever been used in a murder trial?
only once in the country that we know about. In fact, 2 years ago in South Florida, here in Florida, a man avoided the death penalty because a judge allowed jurors to consider that brain mapping evidence. It didn't change the guilt or the innocence, but instead of being put to death, he was given a life sentence without parole, and that could happen again, as I point out with Kenneth Jackson. It's really up to Judge Fuente, and we should have his decision within a few weeks.
Very interesting. You did this story, what, a year or so ago? Now we're revisiting it?
It's going to keep coming back. I don't think there's an end to this one until it goes to the Supreme Court, perhaps.
I would agree with that. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Keith.